Cool. We are live then. Hello and welcome everyone to another webinar from the Anatomy of an API webinar series. We've done two of these webinars before, and we've tried to cover different aspects of the complete API development journey, API development, governance, observability, and this time we have a new topic to talk about. And along with Vedran, who is the CEO of Treblle, this time I have Emmanuel Paraskakis with me. A little bit about Emmanuel, as far as I have learned and understood about his work in the industry. He spent quite a good amount of time working with the major API development products like SmartBear, which has, like, we've all known SmartBear to contribute to OpenAPI. And other than that, he's played a big role leading product management teams across different companies. And now Emmanuel leads as a CEO at Level 250. So today with Emmanuel, the goal of this webinar for the next 1 hour or more, so a little bit, is to talk about building products with governance and strategy. And we look at each aspect of them. But before we go ahead, I would like Emmanuel to say a bunch of words about himself, and then we can kickstart today's webinar.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as you said, I am and have been at the core an API product manager. I've been doing this for about 15 years. Got started out after coming to the US in 2008 and being lucky to get a junior API product manager job within insurance tech. And it turns out that insurance tech is an area where you build very large APIs, very large API models, and you're describing basically the world and engineering and financial contracts with APIs. So that taught me a lot about building APIs. And in the process, I had to learn from others. I had to basically seek and invent, in some cases, tools for building APIs. And that's why I grew my API knowledge and practice. I worked on API design tools. I worked on API management tools. At Oracle, I built the Oracle Cloud's first cloud-native API gateway. And I worked at SmartBear with open API tools for design documentation and testing. Today, I'm a consultant and trainer at a small company that I own, and that company is also a member of the Open API initiative. So I think everybody on this call should consider being a part of the Open API initiative that's guiding and building the spec that we all know.
Definitely. Talking about the Open API spec and being a part of it, Vedran, I'd like you to take ahead and just let everyone who's joined in know about what Treblle does, why we are talking about governance today, and overall, what is anatomy of an API?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Pratim, for the great intro. And again, Emmanuel, really an honor to be here with you and discuss a lot of these things. It's one of those paradoxes that I didn't know about the insurance and the banking industry. Like, I remember somebody asked me when we were starting the company, like, what do you think about going after banking and insurance? I'm like, why? Turns out that you've described it perfectly. If you mentioned 2008. So if you were building APIs in 2008 in insurance, you were probably one of the rarest people to be building APIs, and that's really cool. And I think we're going to talk about those industries a lot because they do have a huge role in everything that happens, I believe, and the tooling that goes around this. But just to kind of sum up what we do at Treblle, so essentially you can think of Treblle helps organizations figure out their APIs. We've got a suite of products. It all starts with an observability product, and it essentially moves through other areas like security, governance, analytics, documentation, compliance, testing, cataloging, and UI. Everything works from a single integration point. You get all the products literally from one integration point. Everything is completely automated and easy to use. It works across any gateway, any cloud provider. So it's a federated platform where you can get all the information about your APIs in one single place. And what's even better, in my opinion, is that it covers the entire API lifecycle across these different teams. So we've been doing this for about, I would say, 3 years now. We've have about 170,000 users that essentially trust Treblle with about, right now, 2.8 billion API requests per month. We've got people from all around the place, any imaginable company in the world. And as part of that effort, we've been working a lot in recent years to basically not just prove ourselves as a company, but also pave way for a lot of the API tooling that's going on. So we've worked, we've been mentioned in a lot of research like Gartner, IDC, Forrester, Everest Group, and all of these others. The last thing that I'm gonna talk about, and then we can move on to some other things, is the API report itself. I do see that somebody raised a hand, Pratim, you can think about how you want to handle that once I finish. But essentially, what we're kind of gonna be inching about, or what the source of the conversation is going to be, is the anatomy of an API report that we publish yearly, usually in Q4, usually in December, but we're going to try to do it sooner this year, so people can actually consume it before the year ends. And what we do there is we actually take a really large data set, about 1 billion API requests, completely random, across about 15,000 APIs and 500,000 endpoints. And we actually look at the raw data around how people are building APIs, what they're doing good, how does security look like, how does governance, how does design, how do all of these different things fit into the play and into the state of APIs today. And this is where we're gonna, touch upon some of these themes around why it's important to do governance, what does that even mean in today's world, and how to go about doing that.
That was pretty I don't think we could have summed up the whole suite of products in a shorter time, but thank you so much, Vedran. There is a lot for me to cover here, and one of the first things that I would like to cover is what scale APIs have reached today and why we are talking about governance. When I started my journey with APIs as a developer, governance was not a word anywhere close into my dictionary. But now that I am looking at larger enterprises and working with larger, working with APIs that communicate with a bigger code base, this is when the word governance has come into my dictionary. And I want to understand, Emmanuel, from you, at what point, first, I would love to know what is your understanding of governance and what does API governance mean? And secondly, even when does this word come into someone's API dictionary or their API life cycle experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think governance, which can be sometimes a scary word, but it doesn't have to be, is all about having some control over your product and being intentional about your product. The reason we've needed governance is that we are now producing so many APIs. And we're producing so many APIs because we have a use for them. We have mobile applications, we have business-to-business SaaS applications, we have AI LLMs that basically we can access through APIs. There's a lot of APIs in the world. And the more of these APIs you have, the easier it is to make mistakes with these APIs. And when mistakes happen, there's consequences. There could be consequences in terms of security, in terms of reputation, in terms of availability of the APIs. So by building intentionally and by having some processes and standards and guidance, we're able to avoid some of these mistakes. The atomic physicist Niels Bohr said this quote that an expert is somebody who's made all the mistakes in a certain field. And so when you become an expert, it's because of the mistakes that you made. And hopefully you're avoiding those mistakes again in the future.
Interesting. It's pretty interesting to me how this is my one observation about people from the API industry and how connected they are to science and physicists. We had Kin last time, and
Yeah.
he very well connected. He said, I quote him, APIs are like electricity, and we need them to run businesses, but we're not concerned about them until we have to scale. And it becomes a big topic when you're talking about scaling your businesses. And I think that's also when you see problems, you make mistakes, and that's when the question comes as like, do I need a singular rule? Does the product need something that everyone will follow? Is Vedran, what are your thoughts on
That's a great question, and I wanted to kind of ask some of these questions to Emmanuel. Obviously, like we've mentioned, financial services, insurance, and banking industries, and I feel like the governments kind of. I wonder where the governance part originated, but if I was a betting man, I bet it was somewhere in one of those companies. And the reason why probably that is, and this is something that I didn't even know when we were starting this journey, is how big the actual API landscape is in a lot of these enterprise companies. Once you start understanding that, you start understanding why there is such a need for governance and why that's now versus a couple of years ago. So if you think about your average enterprise company, it has at least 1,000 APIs. I think Kin had an article as well where he said for every employee, about 1,000 people, there's like 1.2 APIs in the company, which is a fascinating statistics. The largest amounts of APIs that I've personally heard were always from banking companies. And I think, Emmanuel, having said that you worked at the insurance insurance company at the beginning of everything, was there any mention of governance there? Can you share how many APIs you guys had back then? And then what do you think about this notion of, where's the need for API governance coming from?
So I think the need comes from the fact that you have a large number of people interacting with a large number of APIs. You really don't need governance if you're a small startup, at least not initially. That's nowhere near your priorities. But if you are any kind of large multinational corporation, and you have people in all kinds of places and time zones and cultures and languages, they're going to think about building differently. And maybe you also have people that came in through an acquisition. So they're all going to build differently, and you might find overlap, you might find repetition, and so on. So the larger and more complex organizations become, the more you're going to need this type of governance, because people are just going to go independently and try to do things in a different way. When you do things in a different way and inconsistently, then first of all, you make it more difficult for the people who are your customers to use your product, which could be APIs. Secondly, you are wasting resources and time. If you are, as we say, bike shedding all the time about whether I'm going to use standard A or standard B, just make a decision on what standard is best for your industry and never have that conversation again, at least for a certain amount of time. It's not your core business, so don't worry about that. Just make the decision and move on, is what I think. And then you asked about the early days. Of course, in the early days there was no governance, because the perception was, what are APIs? They're only for a small number of developers to do some kind of automation. Remember, this is like 15, 20 years ago. So people didn't even care about the quality of the documentation, the quality of the developer experience, and so on. I remember one VP at the time saying, Emmanuel, like, why should we invest resources in making this documentation good. It's just a bunch of developers. Why does it matter? Well, it turns out over time it did start to matter because we built more and more applications that use APIs. Mobile came along. Um, SaaS B2B buyers demanded APIs, and now we've built entire ecosystems around APIs.
Do you
So
feel
now
like
we need more.
AIs are bringing all of this to the surface right now, especially with the quality of the API, the security of the API, and a lot of these other governance things that need to happen?
It's a very interesting question, and the question breaks down to two parts. So first of all, we see the potential. We think, and everybody says that there are going to be lots of agents trying to access lots of data in the future. We don't know exactly when that's going to happen. I think it's going to happen sooner rather than later, but it's coming for sure. So that means that you're going to have more API consumption, and that more API consumption is going to be from APIs that agents are able to consume. If not, agents are going to go scrape your website. So you have to do something about your APIs to make them easy for agents to understand. So that's one thing. On the other hand, we have this conversation of like, well, we're not going to need APIs anymore because, you know, the agent or the LLM is going to scrape your website. I think that's partially true. If your APIs are not good, yes, the agent will go to your website. Do you want that, or do you want a more controllable way and a more in a way to make more revenue, transactional revenue, or do you want to do it in a haphazard way?
That's a great point. I think when you think about it, I think it's very well said, and especially connection to the revenue. Like, if you're really serious about actually making money from APIs, and I'll actually be more specific, if you're serious about making money from your data, you probably want to have that exposed through an API, because then by implementing proper governance controls and everything else, you can actually charge per API request instead of having that data scraped by a random LLM or something like that, and just being kind of offered for free as a nice add-on to them without them paying you. With an API, you're absolutely right. You have absolute control over, you know, who goes in and what happens, etc., etc. And maybe the final interesting piece around this would be, I think you said, you know, that maybe today it's easier for AI agents to scrape an API, but to scrape a website. But I wouldn't, you know, we're working on some stuff, and I'm sure many others are working on some stuff on essentially enabling these AI agents to basically be able to integrate automatically, like do an ad hoc integration with any API in the world. And again, the prerequisite to that is building APIs that are understandable by machines. And that essentially starts and ends with proper governance, with proper design, and with proper tooling around that.
100%. And it's all about being intentional about the product that you're building. And that's, I think, where product management and API product management comes in. And you make a very interesting point about the scraping of the website. You know, to an agent, the agent doesn't care. It's just going to find, if possible, the data that it needs. To an agent, your website looks like an API. I mean, technically, there's no real difference. It's just in how you present it as a product. That's the
I
difference.
agree.
Before we jump, I think as Emmanuel, just before we started the call, you mentioned that the time to talk about how AI is going to affect will be literally 1 or 2 minutes the moment you get into a conversation. That's funny. But before we head over to the AI conversation, I want to go back, Emmanuel, to something you mentioned about if your product is, just to clarify for me and for everyone who's listening, you said that if your product is an API first product, or depending on some things, that's when governance is really important. One thing I have also seen, and my friends are in the finance industry and everything, no matter, is it true that only API first products need API governance? Or how does it, like, no matter what kind of product you have, if it's built using APIs and it's on a large scale with different kinds of developers, different people touching the API at some level, like as a stakeholder, as a developer, as a PM, governance is important. Am I correct in?
Yeah, I would say it's a matter of scale. Again, lots of APIs, lots of people, lots of stakeholders, the more governance you need.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's easier for people to understand it when you talk about UI, the analogy of UI-based products. So in UI-based products, if you're a couple of developers in a garage starting out, you're just gonna code away and make the UI. If you're building a robust consumer product or a SaaS product, you're going to have designers, you're going to have prototypes, you're going to have wireframes, and you're going to have an entire design language and design system for how you do things with with your products. It's the same thing with APIs, but sometimes people don't understand that. And if you say the UI analogy, people start to get it.
But then how does someone who's, like, for example, if I am an API architect in a large organization and I've been seeing that I need governance to step into my line of work, my product, or my team itself, and this isn't part of my workflow or the company's workflow, how would I introduce it? And this is some questions that I've been hearing when we do meetups or something. I, as a PM or as an experienced PM, I want to understand from you, like, how would that conversation go for a lead API architect or PM?
Yeah, I think, and I would love to hear Vedran's opinion on that as well. But I think you have to have learned from the mistakes that we were talking about earlier, or even research the mistakes that others did. And it's a matter of communicating with your stakeholders. And sometimes that's the C-levels, the people, the board, even the people that have the budget and set the strategic priorities. You have to be able to explain as a PM, as an architect, as an engineering lead, what the consequences are of not having governance or not picking standards or not having a solid process. And you have to kind of project the long game and communicate what the issues might be. And I think that's, especially for senior product managers, for example, that's a core part of the job, getting the stakeholders on the same page and getting to recognize these issues. Vedran, what do you think?
Great question. I have my own opinions in that, but I'll try to stick to what we hear from customers and the questions that they ask us. Recently, we came off of a private cloud deployment with one of our customers, and the number one concern that they had is, how do we actually get this into the hands of our engineers, and how do we present this to them so they don't think that these governance efforts are a huge pain for them, but actually an added bonus, right? Because in a lot of cases, you want to shift, you want governance to shift left and start as soon as you kind of start designing the API. And a lot of the problems that we hear are about which standard should I use, or there is no standard to follow. And I think this is my own pet peeve, and nobody wants to do this. Maybe we do it, but at the end of the day, like, people at the very beginning get confused about who should we follow, what type of rules should we follow if we want to create some kind of, if we want to clean up the mess that we have across 1,000 APIs. So they either overcomplicate that step or oversimplify, because there isn't a book that you could go back to and say, hey, these are the things that you need to do, and if you do those, that's good. So we actually have products that kind of have an opinion, I'm going to say, about what you should do. But obviously, the more mature organizations, I'm going to say, in the financial services banking sector, they usually have their own rules, right? So usually these rules are kind of custom rules written in Spectral or something like that.
Yep.
But the vast majority of people, and this is something that we hear from customers as well, they are aware of these problems especially I would say in the last 6 months. I've been trying to figure out why so many companies want to address this and why the last 6 months. But awareness is there. People are starting to realize it. I think the amount of tooling that is available to actually automate this is not there yet, and the market needs to mature. And I think eventually, what happened with the format is actually something beautiful, because now if you want to define how an API is documented, you can do that. So if I give you my open API spec, Emmanuel or Pratim, you both will understand it. Even though I might speak Croatian, Pratim speaks Dutch, and you speak English, you'll all understand it. And I think we do need a certain set of rules, in my opinion, that says, hey, here's the bare minimum of what makes a good API, and you should build on top of that whatever rules you want. But it doesn't have to be scary. It doesn't have to be too complicated. And it's definitely not something that your engineers will suffer or do anything. It's more about educating, and with proper tooling, all of this can be automated.
The education aspect is super important, of course. And the other aspect that's important, and we find this in platform building as well, it has to be a certain kind of pull motion.
Yeah.
If you ever go top down and say you shall use all of these standards, it's going to be very difficult to enforce that. I've tried it. It just doesn't work. So what it has to be things that make sense. And when you build things that make sense, they have to come from the consumers. You basically have to get the engineers that are going to consume these rules and this governance involved. And you have to start somewhere. And my advice is to start small. Have something. Agree on how we're going to name things. We can agree on that. We can have a small conversation and agree on that. And then agree perhaps on the tools we're going to use. And then you can build off from that. And as you said, some verticals and industries have their own standards. So use those standards. You don't have to rethink them. But basically, it's all about agreements and communication. And that's where I think it's very important to have these lead architects or these product management roles to be able to evangelize this within the organization.
Do you think it would be beneficial? I know there are some Git repositories around this,
Yeah.
but I've seen rule sets from other companies. Do you think more transparency from these leaders in this space would help? Where if we know how a really big bank from US is actually doing some of these things very effectively, do you think it would be beneficial for these to get published or something like that?
Definitely. I'd like to be able to point to an example and say, look, so-and-so large bank and so-and-so large payments company does things this way. Why is this not good enough for us? And, one effort that exists out there, it's called AEP. It's by folks formerly of Google, where they've decided to see if they can codify certain standards and put them in the public domain and say, hey, we've thought about this for a long time, and here's some advice out there, so you don't have to go have those discussions. Again, I was looking yesterday at a Stack Overflow conversation that's been running, I kid you not, for 15 years, and it's about post versus put, and people like Mark Nottingham are in it. The conversation is there for 15 years. Let's close that out. We don't need to have such a long-running conversation.
Interesting.
I remember I was all like this. It's like it's like generations must have passed and this conversation still, because I actively remember this being a conversation when I was back working at a bank, where the manager and my senior and the three of us, we were sitting and having this conversation about when, do you really need to put here, can it not just be a post? Or but I wasn't aware that it's still on. That's surreal to know.
It's still happening. It's still happening. But we are in a place where these conversations have happened, and we have more knowledge, and we can point to more examples. And of course, the other part is we have more tooling. Yes, maybe the tooling is not 100% and entirely there and 100% adopted, but we do have tooling that we didn't have. We have tooling for API design and artifacts. You mentioned Open API and all of its derivative specs. We have tooling for testing. We have tooling for linting. We have the OWASP API top 10, things that we didn't have before. So we've made real progress. I think it's a huge part of it is educating the user base and letting people know where to go find that information. Where are the RFCs? Where is it described? And like you said, what are other people using? Point to some good examples.
This is also something that we briefly discussed during last webinar, where we also came, one of the conclusions was that yes, API is a very old technology. We've had a lot of innovation since crazy ages, but why are we still talking about it? Because the education hasn't caught up with the things that have been done, and mistakes are still being made, which were solved years ago. And that connects me to the point about, like, we're talking about AI readiness for APIs, and then we bring up this very boring topic of like governance. Like, why the leads want to know what new AI thing we are building, and then why are you talking about governance, which is so boring? But when I look at it, I feel like it's all connected, and even if this sounds boring, your product will probably require to come back to governance at some point.
Well, I'll tell you what, one of the most surprising things that came out of your report, which I love, by the way, we need to have these reports because we need to use them as an industry, was the fact that I think you were saying 85% of APIs have no rate limiting. Well, that's a huge red flag. We got to get the basics right, people, because without rate limiting, your API has the potential of being nuked. And I mean unavailable for others. So if you're depending on your API for some kind of functionality, your app, revenue, customers, whatever it is, you're going to have a problem if you don't have rate limiting. And it's going to end up being a reputation problem. You're going to be in the news. And the reason I say it is because I've gotten to the top of Hacker News because of things like that. Not a thing that I would want to do in that way. So we got to get those basics right. And in the age of AI, usage is going to be very spiky. It's going to be very transient. So if you don't have that rate limiting capability in place, just one of the things you need to be thinking about, then you'll be in a world of pain.
When you mention rate limiting, I think this is a very close and personal subject for Pratim recently, because she published an API without rate limiting, and she asked me, like, what do you think, should I do it? And we were in a rush. I'm like, just do it without it and then add it. In the meantime, she got DDoSed, or the API that she developed got DDoSed because it didn't have a rate limiting. So these are serious things, like you said, and I don't. Some of these, the things that we've learned are really worrying, especially when it comes to security. And I think when we think about governance at Treblle, we like to think about it as three pillars: design, security, and performance. And one of the kind of lowest scores that we see fascinating is in insecurity. I think performance, historically, given that we've been doing this for 2 years, and I've been looking at this data for at least another year, performance has gotten better, right? So people started realizing that, nobody's going to wait a couple of seconds for your API, especially in today's world where the attention span is like 3 seconds. If you're not feeding that data to whatever the consumer device or consumer experiences, you're not going to have a lot of customers, you're not going to have a lot of revenue. And it all starts with an API. So that, I think, has been understood, that if you want to, be a leader, if you want to actually have a really good product, your API needs to be fast. I think we've talked about this multiple times, but when it comes to security, and I think this is something that I mentioned even with your example, Pratim. Like why people think nobody will notice the security is because they can't see the APIs, right? So our thinking was like, oh, nobody knows about the API, like nobody's gonna do anything about it. But you wouldn't believe how easy it is to find a lot of things just based off of your URL or one endpoint that you're exposing. And like you said, Emmanuel, you could be at the top of Hacker News at any point in time. So I think solving security is something that we see a lot of enterprises very interested this year. I think the last piece to solve will be design. And I think a lot of companies are also thinking about this, but I think that's going to be the last solve that we do, because like you said, we're still debating how to name things, right? And I feel like this is a debate that has kind of long passed, but in a lot of these companies, people are building APIs willy-nilly and however they want. And this is something that we're actually trying to fix with some of our governance product, that kind of, you just give your open API spec, we'll lint it, we'll actually make an API request, and we'll give you an automated score that goes from 0 to 100 or A, B, C, D, E, F. So you can easily understand that. Because I think for most enterprise architects or people who are actually, tasked with fixing and solving this, the number one problem that they have is, how do I go through thousands of APIs and actually understand which ones need immediate fixing? What's my top priority? What's my medium priority? What's the lowest priority? Just getting that info is crucial to them. And again, something we do through Treblle, we give you that automated score. It's seamless, and you can understand where to go. But just having that and then diving deeper into a particular API is probably what we hear the most. So I feel like people don't even know what the APIs that they have do, in what shape they are, and where do they get started with fixing them.
Yeah. I think having the security tools is very important. Some of the tools that you describe, I wish we had back in the day. Those are the tools that we should have had back in the day. So I'm really glad you're building them. The problem with security is one that is infrequent, right? Performance, like if my mobile app is not performing and it's slow, it's going to annoy me and my customers every day. So I'm going to see it. But security is kind of like earthquakes and wildfires. It only happens rarely, and then it's spectacular.
Yeah.
So it's not that visible. And again, it's a communication and education aspect. We have to bring it to the attention of people. And then you mentioned design. That's going to be the last. Well, I personally think that, and it's controversial, but we're probably just going to be designing for agents from now on. It doesn't even matter what we'll be designing for humans. Yes, we're going to be designing to standards, best practices, and so on, but our main audience is going to be autonomous agents, I think. So there's a lot of work and thinking to happen about what's good for these agents. And, we need to focus on discoverability, ease of onboarding. How is the agent going to pay for services? Does the LLM understand what even my data model is, my semantics, and so on? So these are the things that are going to be important from now on.
I couldn't agree more. I think fundamentally, and this is something that I commented at the beginning, I think the growing need for a lot of these changes, and why people are taking a second look at their API landscape is exactly what's happening in the AI world. Because a lot of these companies are starting to realize, hey, if we feed this to an AI assistant or AI agent, it won't be able to understand how to connect this API or parse the data from there, because we've made it purposefully or accidentally basically impossible to consume. So I think there's going to be a huge push to, like you said, get all of these things consumed and get all of these things updated, where yes, integrating with an AI agent or an AI assistant is just going to be a click away.
I have a question for both of you. Like when you folks talk about use of LLMs, like I use LLMs on a daily basis to develop things. Sometimes, let's be honest, to even develop APIs, to write the code for these APIs.
Yeah.
But what I have noticed is every LLM, how they are trained, how things are different. We are still not at a point where no matter what LLM you're using, it will come up with the same design, same structure. It's not like tomorrow if I use DeepSeek and today like Claude, both of them have different ways of looking at design. And even if we are having LLMs build like APIs, code, or like do everything, will we still need governance for LLMs? How will, because yes, we will be there, AGI will come, everybody is waiting for that. But
Yeah.
I don't know, like for the next 10 years, while we are in this change where it's humans plus AI doing that, like in this space, who do we build for? Like, how do we work together? And overall, even if LLMs are doing it, we come into picture. I come into picture where I am making sure if the design is what I want or no. Do you like? Do you guys have any idea how this would change? Or because this is a bit blurry for me.
I have some first-hand experience. So I've been using LLMs as well to design APIs. And what I've done is, hey, produce me an open API document according to my wishes in the prompt. And that's great. And as you say, that's obviously non-deterministic. And sometimes, the underlying models changes like, wow, it's totally different. So the way to do this is to start baking the governance into the context and the guidelines and the guardrails for the model. So if people want to go try this out, I've got a custom GPT on Open AI called Chat API. And I've started to bake in some of the standards that we talked about here inside the custom GPT. It's not quite there yet, but it's doing very, very well. And I measure it against tools like what Treblle has, where it rates your API, and I can see that progress over time. And my hope is that companies like Treblle will build a tool so that the LLM can pull governance rules from it. And that's going to be a tool accessible via API. And that way, I can bake in all my standards and governance as an organization into those custom tools and say, this is the way I want to build APIs, and leave those decisions that have been made to the tool. How does that sound?
Sounds great. To add on top of that, I definitely agree. I can actually kind of draw a parallel between API governance and actually productivity and cost savings and actual revenue dollars, because I remember there was a study from a company called Retail Tech Solutions or something like that, where they actually went through this process of basically introducing governance, API governance specifically, and then kind of started tackling their entire API landscapes, started tackling different redundancies, inconsistent documentations, everything that we consider to be well under the API governance scope. And kind of they measured 3 really concrete example results that I think any company wants to see. So the number 1 was cost savings. So essentially, when they took a look at the API landscape, everything they had, and kind of did the discovery, did a lot of these different things they discovered that they had a lot of redundant development efforts going on at the same time, and managed to reduce about 1.2 million in a single year just by actually revising their API catalog and doing some governance on it. Secondly, they dramatically speed up their time to market. And this is something that you definitely want to do in a world where we talk a lot about AI agents. If you can actually push something out much faster, you are, a leader there. And what they've saw is after they've actually started using standards when building these APIs, they spot up their entire development team by 40%, right? Because everybody knows what they need to do. Everybody knows how to do it. I don't have to think twice about naming this. I don't have to think twice about headers. I don't have to think twice about security. All of these things are just a checklist for me. Again, with proper tooling, are a checklist for me. And the last thing, and I think this was even more important, is essentially enhanced scalability. I think the report reported something around that they were able to basically manage more than 50% increase in traffic during sales peak periods, because they actually identified all of these bottlenecks and performance issues and design issues and kind of build better tooling. So I think when people ask us about governance and the impact of governance, you have concrete examples where this is helping and unlocking value, not just for engineers, not just for agents, but actually for the company, for the leadership, and for all the stakeholders of the company.
Yeah, super important to measure the before and after, and I'm glad you brought up metrics. It's probably one of the most important things to look at as as part of the process of governance.
I agree.
Would you both agree that AI's LLMs learn based on what data is fed, then they build over that, on top of that? Would you both agree to the fact that the next, I don't know, I don't want to put a number on the years, but this time and what we are going to build in the near future, if we have better standards, that's when our LLMs will actually be at a point where they build better APIs also. So while we are talking about there was this very famous funny quote from GitHub when people are not happy with Copilot, like they put out a huge banner in SF only, I think, saying that don't blame us, your code is crappy, that's why the suggestions are crappy. And connecting that back to APIs, I think, like, if we don't fix the APIs we build right now, probably LLMs are going to keep suggesting us crappy ways to build them.
I mean,
agree.
the LLM is only a mirror of what they've been trained on, which is very important to go and put in RAG or in some other way the things that are kind of absolute for you, that are part of your rules and governance.
I agree. Whatever we do, not just on how we build APIs impacts all of these things, but I think the biggest impact on unlock or the side effect of doing good governance is going to be the speed and ease of integration, because you literally, if you build an API that could easily be integrated, doesn't matter if it's a engineer at the other side of that screen or it's a LLM or an agent understanding the spec and integrating it. Again, you're just simply speeding up your time to market, speeding up time to revenue, and all of these other metrics that are actually important to your business.
I'm just getting a call. I don't know why my phone has been buzzing for the last 15 minutes. I hope it's not urgent, so I'm just going to be back.
There's a couple of questions also in the chat.
Yeah, let's wrap this up because we've been we've been doing this for a couple of minutes. I think Pratim is gonna move to the next slide once she's back. But essentially, there are two questions that we are gonna answer right now, and we can also, if you guys have any questions, you could just raise a hand or you could type it into the QA section on Zoom. So I'm gonna basically read the questions, and then you can take the first one, and I'll take the second one. So the first one, Emmanuel, is this. This is question about innovation versus regulation. How can organization enforce governance without slowing down innovation? Is it only about communication and education, or are there other ways for that?
You know, it's a very good question, because there's a very fine line between, you know, being too restrictive and being too open. I think where you draw the line is the things that you care about and don't care about. Do you really care about the casing and the naming of the headers? If you really don't, if it's not material to your business, then make that decision and move on. If it's about something that will stifle your innovation, of course, don't put it in a hard and fast rule. And I think we talked about earlier about the pull aspect. So don't go top down, but have that pull aspect. That's going to help you, not stifle that innovation in your organization. Just to make it very quick.
Okay. The second one was, and by the way, on your screen, Emmanuel, if you want to, before we answer the next one and wrap up, if you want to give a couple of words about the slide that you see right here.
Yeah, absolutely. We talked about education and how it's very important. And I decided to do something about it. I've got a couple of courses out there that are live, like they're in a live cohorts manner. And one of them I'm doing as we speak. I had the first session yesterday. It's called API Fundamentals for Product Managers. And the next one that's coming up, it's called API Product Mastery for Experienced PMs. And it's for PMs that have already done something with APIs. They're familiar with APIs. Maybe they shipped a few API products, but they want to scale and they want to become experts. And if you scan the code here on your screen, you get a discount. I'd love to see you there in that course. But it's about building out that education that we talked about earlier.
Cool. We've got a couple of more questions incoming. Pratim, do you want to read the first one and then we'll go to the second one?
Definitely. This is a pretty interesting one, and I know, Vedran, you already have a few things working on that around, could AI agents help prevent API abuse?
I mean, I think that given where we know the state, we've talked about some of the things like 85% of companies not having rate limits, including some of our APIs. So I actually think that the AI agents could cause API abuse.
Contributing to it.
I think the way that they could prevent it, I mean, there is a way of doing that, of course, but it comes back if the API is properly built, then the AI agents or LLMs will be able to understand that, will understand what the rate limits are, and won't start calling that. But again, if you're not designing a good API, you're going to have a very, very bad time if you start exposing these APIs to your AI agents, LLMs, or even partners.
Emmanuel, do you have a different take on this?
Not a completely different take, but I just want to say that LLMs are good at recognizing patterns. You can use that to basically recognize abuse better with training. Yeah. And I just love this next question that came from Sarthak as well.
Definitely, I'd like you to go for it then. The question is, the governance rules standards have been evolving really well and is being adopted for REST APIs. However, when it comes into protocols like async, we don't have much. How do you feel this is scaling?
Why it's a very good question, because so-called REST APIs were there kind of first before async or before GraphQL, gRPC, what have you. I think, first of all, there's learnings from what we have today that carry over to any kind of API. Even before REST APIs, there's a really good lecture by a guy called Joshua Block from back in 2007 about what's a good API design and why it matters. And it doesn't talk about web APIs. It talks about any kind of API. So these topics carry over, first of all. Second, the state of the art is evolving. Just because a REST or a SOAP API was there first, we've built more knowledge about it. But for async, for example, we are building knowledge and standards. We have a spec now, we have more people using it, and so on. And same thing for GraphQL. The tools have evolved and the know-how has evolved. And the more we adopt them, the more it's going to evolve.
That's a great question. I can already see that you might be in one of those industries, financial, banking, or insurance, if you're asking about async APIs. I think the majority of enterprise companies is starting to tackle REST-based APIs, and let alone async. So kudos on being at the forefront of technology. I think, as always, like some of these strategies and rules and standards are driven by the need. Right now, there's a huge need for the API, the REST API landscape, and based on a lot of conversations that we have, I would say that like 90% of all APIs in your average company are REST based, and I'm sure that you're gonna see something similar happening with these newer types of APIs. But again, if you use our product, both the Treblle platform that comes with governance and insights, you can get all of these standards, and you can get automated governance out of the box on any type of an API.
I'm gonna pop up one question ahead, which is from Sakshi. How do you address concerns around data privacy and security when deploying APIs for AI LLMs? And what best practices do you recommend?
Yeah, I think it's using tools in API management like Treblle has. You should be using these tools. You should be installing them correctly and using them correctly to begin with. I think it becomes that much more important with APIs for AI LLMs. If you have privacy issues or compliance issues, it's not that more different. It just might be more, more pervasive and proliferate more. So do the basics right, I would say.
I agree, and I don't want to, not that I like propping up my product all the time, but again, I think when you think about the intersection of APIs and AI agents, I think fundamentally the one thing that you want to know at all times is what is it that your API is returning to the LLM, and this starts with you having a set of tools that starts with observability that allows you to actually see what people are inputting and what the API is returning. Because the thing with these AI agents and LLMs is, because it's like natural language, you can trick it to do a lot of different things. So number one, you actually want to have access to all the requests and all the payloads and all the responses that all of these APIs are happening and when they're happening. And you, like Emmanuel said, there's a lot of stuff where you can build in. And again, we have a product for compliance specifically, where you can build these at least safeguards. So when you do expose private information in any combination, we actually check for things like GDPR, CCPA, PCI DSS. So we actually scan all your API responses and look whether or not you might be in a breach. You can automate a lot of these things. So even if something like this happens, it's going to happen once before you actually fix it.
And just use good design, good intentional design up front to get ahead of it.
Yeah.
This is something that I'm literally working on right now. And when Vedran was talking about how your responses help you understand if your APIs, AI APIs are working correctly. Like one of the fun projects that I did recently, this is where I realized there was a unique case where people were using that API for the use case that it was not meant for, although it was very well prompted into. And if I wouldn't have seen that based on the response, because I cannot work for all edge cases, like there will always be some edge cases with LLMs where people are still finding new things about what can break an LLM, what can break, no matter how strong a prompt is. So if I wouldn't have been able to go back to my API and see that real time about how my response, like how this particular request has broken my response, it would have caused the company a great load of credits and probably some more pain on my side. But yeah, having the right tools, this is how I look at it, having the right tools to fix things as soon as possible while we are in an age where AI is literally changing things every second is the best way you can make sure you're coping up with it.
We've got the final question, and then we're wrapping up. You want to do the honors, Pratim?
Definitely. Thanks for doing this. In the age of AI agents, what's the most critical aspect of API governance? Compliance, security, or access?
You want
Emmanuel?
to take it away, Emmanuel, and then I'll.
Yeah, I think to put it quickly, four things you should probably care about. One is discoverability, and being able to advertise the capabilities of your API, and that comes from having an API catalog and being able to actually tell what the API can do. The second is having the machine readable descriptions like Open API or Async API or something else that are very easy for machines to understand. And then I would say make onboarding seamless, self-serve, so that the agent can come and actually consume right now versus in 3 days when you send them back the email or whatever it is. And perhaps the last one would be have a way for the agent to easily pay for that capability in a transactional kind of manner, in a pay-as-you-go manner. Pay for that outcome versus, you're not going to send the agent a sales contract to sign. It has to happen right now. So those are the four things I would say that you should be paying attention to.
I agree. I would just add maybe on top of the list between security, access, and compliance would be design. I think that's often the overlooked one because it's very mythical, and it's like in that movie Wolf of Wall Street, Fugazi. It's one of those things, but I think it's an overlooked one for sure.
Cool. I think we are right on time. For everyone who's interested in knowing more details about the report, you can find it on Treblle.com. The report is available on the website. We would love you to give any feedback about the report, about the governance side of APIs, and definitely looking forward to the feedback. Emmanuel, thank you for being here. I love having this conversation with you, and hopefully we can see you again. We can have another conversation with you.
100%. It was great to be here, and like super interesting questions and super interesting conversation from everyone here. I'd love to be back.
Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you, Pratim, so much. And again, somebody asked about resources. We'll definitely share all the resources that Emmanuel pointed out, and all the resources that we do, and some of the products that we have that tackle a lot of these problems in an email after this webinar. Thanks so much, everybody, for joining. And we're gonna try to do these once a month. So see you in March.
Yes, see you in March. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.